It was always a dream to be the first to fly around the world at the equator. 27,000 miles, an incredible aerial journey for the 1930s. No one had ever done it, and now a woman would be the first. That woman was Amelia Earhart.
This new Lockheed is the realization of a dream.
In May 1937, Amelia Earhart took off on the flight that was to be the crowning achievement of her career. 6 weeks later, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, disappeared without a trace in the South Pacific.
She's so well known, and she just disappears off the face of the earth. Well, that can't be. What kind of an ending is that?
"60 years after Amelia's final flight, a team led by Texas aviator Linda Finch painstakingly restored a Lockheed Electra and set out to recreate and relive Amelia's round-the-world adventure.
Now this is the critical point.
Navigator Bowen Weisheit has carefully studied Earhart's last flight and believes he may have solved the mystery of her disappearance.
If she had kept on going, she would have overflown that island in 15 minutes about. But she didn't.
This is the story of Amelia Earhart's last flight, in which we'll discover what may have happened in the final hours. To fly is an age-old dream. Amelia Earhart was a girl from Kansas who dreamed of adventure from her earliest years. When she was 7, in 1904, she rode her first roller coaster at the St. Louis World's Fair. "It's just like flying," she told her sister. In her early 20s, she had an experience that changed her life.
A young woman friend and I had gone to the fairgrounds to see an exhibition of stunt flying by one of the aces returned from the war. We watched a small plane turn and twist in the air, black against the sky, excepting when the afternoon sun caught the scarlet of its wings. After 15 or 20 minutes of stunting, the pilot began to dive at the crowd. I remember the mingled fear and pleasure which surged over me as I watched that small plane at the top of its earthward swoop. I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. Frank Hawks took me on the first hop. By the time I'd got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly.
Amelia's first big flying adventure came in 1928. She was chosen to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger. On June 18th, after flying 20 hours from Newfoundland, the plane landed off the coast of Wales, and Amelia Earhart was suddenly world famous. Just 4 years later, she did the same crossing alone, flying her own plane.
At 12 minutes after 7, I gave her the gun. The plane gathered speed and, despite the heavy load, rose easily. A minute later, I was headed out to sea.
It was May 20th, 1932, the 5th anniversary of Charles Lindbergh's solo flight. Since then, 20 people had died attempting the crossing. No one had duplicated his feat.
Amelia Earhart Putnam, first woman to solo the Atlantic, picked a hillside near Londonderry, Ireland, to land.
I believe that women have as much courage as men.
Those flights alone took a tremendous amount of courage and thrust her into the limelight, which she proceeded to stay in, really, throughout the whole decade of the 30s with successive, interesting, exciting, and dangerous flights.
In 1934, Amelia was the first person, man or woman, to solo the Pacific from Honolulu to California. Another triumph. She was the most famous woman flyer of her day, a beacon of hope in the dark days of the Depression. But how could she cap what she'd done before? In 1936, she began planning her most ambitious project, a flight around the world at the equator in a brand new Lockheed Electra.
Watch your front, Bob. You're getting real close. Do we want the table under it yet or not?
One of the many people who have been inspired by Amelia's life is Linda Finch. In 1995, Finch decided she would honor the spirit of Amelia Earhart by recreating and attempting to complete her world flight.
I want to move this board back a little bit now. Can we pull out and give me some slack and let me do that?
She'd fly the same type of plane on the same flight plan as closely as possible, 60 years to the day after Amelia's journey began.
Right here. Keep going. I got it with my hand.
Okay. Oh, that's great.
Oh, my goodness. It's absolutely beautiful. It's such a graceful airplane, all the lines.
The plane I'm using on the proposed flight is a transport plane. It is a Lockheed Electra, normally carrying 10 passengers and 2 pilots.
There were only a handful of Lockheed Electras still surviving anywhere on Earth. One was lying in a sorry state at the back of a hangar in Wisconsin. Linda Finch decided to buy it. Though she had restored other old airplanes in the past, this was to be her greatest challenge yet. It would take Linda and her team 2 years to restore the plane, disassembling it and checking each of the hundreds of pieces and making many new parts to replace those that were missing or damaged. The work was completed just days before the plane was scheduled to leave from Oakland, California, on the 60th anniversary of Amelia's departure. Reconstructing the plane was one part of the preparation. Planning the trip was the other. Reed Dennis coordinated the flight plans for the Lockheed and for the accompanying camera plane that he'd be piloting. In contrast to the often inaccurate maps and primitive weather data available to Amelia, the World Flight team would have a GPS satellite navigation system and detailed weather images throughout. The camera plane was a Grumman Albatross, a classic amphibian from the 1950s.
It's something I've wanted to do for a long, long time, is fly around the world, and it's a great opportunity to do it and be a part of this Amelia Earhart recreation trip.
Amelia Earhart poses with the men who fly on the first part of her world trip. Technical advisor Mance, then Miss Earhart. Next, as navigator to Australia, Captain Harry Manning, and also navigator Noonan, familiar with Pacific Airways.
World Flight captured the world's imagination in 1937 and again 60 years later. On the day of departure, hundreds of well-wishers came to Oakland to see the planes off.
Today, on the 60th anniversary of her departure, we'll recreate and complete Amelia Earhart's flight.
On March 17, 1997, Linda Finch's team set out to recreate the great adventure that Amelia had pioneered. Throughout her journey, Amelia sent back letters and news reports, which give us an extraordinary insight into her experience.
As we passed through it, the Golden Gate was truly golden. Behind us, dark clouds closed in. But westward, the sky was cheerful with late afternoon sunlight, which burnished the slopes of Mount Tamalpais on one hand and Storybook San Francisco on the other, as we headed westward over the great new bridge.
Recreating Amelia Earhart's final flight would take the two planes on a journey of around 30,000 miles across 5 continents and 3 oceans. Back in 1937, Amelia's plane flew entirely alone. The first leg was one of the longest, to Hawaii, 2,500 miles away across the Pacific.
Why are you attempting this around-the-world flight? Because I want to. That was as near a complete reply as I could devise. Here was a shining adventure beckoning with new experiences, added knowledge of flying, of peoples, of myself. At 5:40 in the morning, Honolulu time, we sighted Diamond Head. It put in an appearance through the morning mists exactly where and when Fred expected it, which was most comforting. We had hoped to push on to Howland promptly, but soon found that weather conditions to the southwestward weren't what they might be. Delay was inevitable. But if one has to wait, in all the world there is no pleasanter place to do the waiting than in Honolulu. In my life, I had come to realize that when things were going very well indeed, it was just the time to anticipate trouble. The first gray light of day was seeping down over the eastern hills upon Pearl Harbor. We had decided on a dawn start. It is amazing how much can happen in one dawn. We had 900 gallons of gasoline on board. However, this load was not by any means the ship's limit. Indeed, so easily was the plane moving down the runway that I thought the takeoff was actually over. 10 seconds later, the airplane which brought us so gallantly to Honolulu lay helpless on the concrete runway, a poor, battered bird with broken wings. My own desire, I'm sure, was set almost before the slithering slide along the concrete ended. If we don't burn up, I want to try again. Something like that flashed through my mind. Miraculously, fire spared us.
The badly damaged Electra was shipped back to California for repairs. Amelia and her crew returned home. The crash had badly shaken Amelia, but she was determined to make another attempt. She didn't want this one failure to overshadow all the successes she had fought so hard for. Back in California, Amelia had to face the press.
One has to take misfortune with good fortune. Through the years, I've been very fortunate in the type of flying I've done not to have more accidents. I hope to continue the flight as I planned. I have perfect faith in my equipment, the plane and the engine, and I hope to carry on eventually as soon as it is repaired.
In the aftermath of the crash in Hawaii, Harry Manning resigned as navigator, telling Amelia that his leave of absence from the Navy would expire before she could try again. Years later, Manning would say the real reason was that he no longer had faith in Amelia's ability as a pilot. Navigator Fred Noonan would take his place.
Amelia Earhart will try again. The famous aviatrix inspects her $80,000 flying laboratory, which has been overhauled. She's almost ready for another attempt at a round-the-world flight at the equator in the 10,000-pound ship that cracked up in Honolulu nearly 2 months ago.
Amelia spent her personal fortune repairing the plane. This flight now had to be a success to recoup her huge investment.
To keep going, I more or less mortgaged the future. Without regret, however, for what are futures for?
In May, Amelia left Oakland on her second attempt with a minimum of fanfare. Didn't officially announce that she was trying again. In the months since her first attempt, the weather had changed, so she decided to switch the direction of the flight from west to east. From the US, she'd go to South America, then across the Atlantic to Africa, east to Arabia and India, down through Southeast Asia, through the islands of Indonesia, Northern Australia, New Guinea, across the Pacific to Howland Island, Hawaii, and back to California.
Lockheed 72 Golf Tango Burbank.
May 1937, Amelia Earhart took off on the flight that was to be the crowning achievement of her career. 6 weeks later, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, disappeared without a trace in the South Pacific.
She's so well known, and she just disappears off the face.
It was always a dream to be the first to fly around the world at the equator.
To the Earth. Well, that can't be. What kind of an ending is that?
"60 years after Amelia's final flight, a team led by Texas aviator Linda Finch painstakingly restored a Lockheed Electra and set out to recreate and relive Amelia's round-the-world adventure.
Now this is the critical point.
Navigator Bowen Weisheit has carefully studied Earhart's last flight and believes he may have solved the mystery of her disappearance. 27,000 miles, an incredible aerial journey for the 1930s. No one had ever done it, and now a woman would be the first. That woman was Amelia Earhart.
This new Lockheed is the realization of a dream.
In May